Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Welcome to our introductory class on our level 3 class in Islamic law, in which we are looking at the fiqh of transactions, fiqh al-mu'amalat, from Kanz al-Daqa by Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi. And the purpose of this class today is to introduce the subject and the text briefly before we jump into its direct study, and a few pointers on how we can benefit from this chapter, which can be a little bit daunting if it's if you're not directly familiar with these matters. So firstly, this is a level 3 class, so properly speaking, someone should have done Quduri, the Mukhtasar of Quduri, or the Mukhtar of Imam al-Mawsili, or a similar short matan that covers the sections on transactions. Shaykh Tabriz Azam, for example, who's someone to benefit from, bi'idhnillah. He has, he uses the like a brief matan called Kifayatul Rabi, Kifayatul Mubtadi, yeah, al-Isqati, right? Kifayatul Mubtadi. And he has a course on that, and that's a good text. It's got a number of commentaries on it as well. So you should have done something before in the fiqh of transactions to be familiar with, because Kanz al-Daqa'iq is a treasure chest of subtleties, right? As we've, those of you who are continuing in this class from our ongoing class on the fiqh of worship, you will realize that. So that really helps. Now, if your knowledge of the fiqh of transactions is rusty, then we would recommend that you follow along either in lessons on Quduri, and we'll hasten, inshallah, to make our lessons on Quduri transaction. They're available, right? If they're not already available, we'll hasten to ensure that they are available at Seekers, because we have lessons on Quduri. We also have lessons on the Mukhtar, and those help, right? Because that introduces the subject. We are working here on the assumption that you've studied Quduri or the Mukhtar or something equivalent to it, like Kifayat al-Mubtadi, etc. Kifayat al-Mubtadi, right? Bi'idhnillah. So that's the first thing, right? Because this issue of tadarruj, of going gradually, is the key to attainment. And the mashayikh say that it's a grave error for people to jump past Quduri or a similar text. That's point number one about this subject. Then transactions itself can seem daunting, right? Can seem daunting. Why? Because most of the time in our religious study, when we look at fiqh, we look at worship, things, purification, prayer, things that we're quite familiar with. But transactions are significantly distinct. One, because transactions are in of themselves completely worldly, right? Completely worldly. So, and their components are rather mundane, right? Buying things, selling things, the price, this, that. These seem like a worldly endeavor, but they are of great significance, because the importance of something, right? The importance of something is judged in a number of different ways. You can judge the importance of something either by, they say, sharaful ilm, right? So there's a number of ways you judge the merit of a knowledge. Sharaful ilm bihasabi sharafil ma'loom. Right? One of the ways is, and this is sort of the case for theology at a general level, that the nobility of something is in accordance with what is known through it. In that sense, there's nothing that compares in general to the science of theology. Or at a general level. At a high level, nothing compares to the science of spirituality. Because what is the subject matter of spirituality is not just to affirm God, but to be present with God, right? That's one way of looking at why, theology at a general level, aqidah at a general level, or tasawwuf, which is experiential faith, are the ultimate sciences, right? But fiqh, right? Fiqh in general relates to human actions, right? Now, insofar as it relates to human actions, what is more noble? What is more noble? Worship or transactions? What do you guys think? What is more noble? Worship or transactions?
Worship.
Worship, but why?
It's the right of Allah.
It's the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So because these are acts of worship, their primary purpose is the difference between ibadat and mu'amalat. Ibn Abdin explains this when he opens Kitab al-Buyu'a. The difference between ibadat and mu'amalat, that the ibadat, the acts of worship, are al-maqsud, al-a'mal, that الأعمال التي مقصودها الأصلي التقرب إلى الله. Those acts whose primary purpose is to draw closer to Allah. Mu'amalat, transactions, their primary purpose is al-ma'isha, living, considerations related to the worldly life. So in that sense, worship comes first, right? Now, if something were absolutely better, you wouldn't do anything else at a superficial level, although there's something called comparative advantage, and you can read up on how comparative advantage is understood, right? Or comparative benefit. But what if we were to say that no, there is a consideration for the superiority of mu'amalat over ibadat, right? Worldly transactions are superior, are more important than acts of worship. Why would that be?
Because transactions may relate to the right of others.
Transactions may relate, by definition they do. Transactions are things between two parties. Because transactions relate to the rights of other people. But why is that more important?
There isn't enough awareness generally relating to the rules of...
Yeah, so this is where something to think about is there are different bases or different considerations for why one thing is more important than another, right? Right? Which is why you cannot just do one thing, right? Like someone's in the masjid making dhikr, they have to use the toilet. Is making dhikr superior or going to the toilet? Right? In itself, there's no point of comparison, but you gotta go, right? So there are many considerations. When you need to go to the toilet, going to the toilet is what you need to do right then. And you are rewarded more for that than doing other things if you do it with intention. Now, one of the bases of sharaf, right, of nobility, is to look at شرف الشيء بحسب الضرر المترتب، شرف العلم بحسب الضرر المترتب على الجهل به. One of the ways of knowing the nobility of a science or the importance of a science is to consider what is the harm of not knowing it. Right? So in worship, and worship's very serious. It's a maqsood al-asli of al-kawn, right? The whole, all of existence, it is there, to that there be devotion to God, right? وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. But worst case scenario, if we don't worship, وَلِعِيَذُ بِاللَّهِ, what is the harm in it? Who is harmed directly?
Yourself.
Go ahead, تفضلوا. Who is harmed?
Ourselves.
Yeah, we harm ourselves, right? We harm ourselves, right? We harm ourselves, and that's serious. You harm yourself, it's serious. You don't have you're not allowed to harm yourself, right? That's from Allah's mercy, right? Don't harm yourself, but right, that's darar qasir. The harm is limited directly to the one affected, and it's your right. You could squander it. You bear the consequences, right? You have authority over yourself. So, like, if someone wants to go to hell, everything in the Sharia is saying, don't go, stop, warning, cliff ahead, whatever. If someone wants to jump, Alam ya'tikum nadhir. Did the warner and the warnings not come to you? Okay. But the khatar of the mu'amalat is that there's a direct khatar, which is that the mu'amalat, by their definition, relate to haqq al-ghayr, to the rights of others, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free of need. So Allah's right, وَمَا ظَلَمُونَ لَكِنْ كَانُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ يَظْلِمُونَ. They did not wrong us, but it was themselves that they were wronging. Right? So as relates to the right of Allah, when we do not fulfill the right of Allah, we have not wronged Allah. Allah cannot be wronged in that sense. The person is wronging themselves. They have a right to wrong themselves. They're warned, don't do it, etc. But, right? But it's also limited. But in mu'amalat, this relates to the rights of others. All transactions by different sales, hire, etc. All of them require two parties. So there's, in your transactions, there's you and there's another party. So haqqul ibad, right? So they say حقوق الله مبنية على التوسع, right? والتيسير والمسامحة. Right? The rights of Allah are based on expansiveness and facilitation and mercy and overlooking, as grave as they are. But the حقوق العباد, but the rights of Allah's creation are based on mutalaba, are based on demand. Why? لغنى الله وفقر العباد. Because Allah is free of need, servants are needy at many levels, I guess we know. That's number one. But number two, if you don't fulfill the rights of Allah, you've wronged yourself. You have a right to wrong yourself. The Sharia warns you, etc. There are also social implications to your wronging yourself, which the Sharia takes into account. It's not publicizing your sin, etc., etc. Right? But that's due to its harmful secondary considerations. And those harmful secondary considerations of your non-worship are things that are taken into account by the Sharia, because it's like secondhand smoke. If someone is smoking drugs, for example, who are they harming? Directly themselves. But there'll be people who are not culpable for consuming those drugs, but if the smoke goes in, and they inhale it, they'll suffer as well. And there is a secondary ta'addi, spreading of the harm of remissness in worship. But in mu'amalat, if someone does not fulfill rights and responsibilities, you are wronging another. You are wronging another who is needy. So that ta'addi, right? And they say there are principles of benefit and harm, right? That كما أن النفع المتعدي خير من النفع القاصر فكذلك الضرر المتعدي شر من الضرر القاصر. Okay, this is an important principle. Just as the benefit that benefits others is greater in reward than the benefit that is restricted to yourself, likewise, فكذلك الضرر المتعدي, harm that is transitive, right, that harms others and is wider, is graver than harm that is restricted, that is qasir, upon yourself or upon, right? And one of the most beneficial reads on the notions of benefit and harm that's accessible, there's many works on this. Amongst the things that we can recommend for students of knowledge is al-Qawa'id al-Sughra, just short work, not much more than 100 sparse pages in a modern edition by Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, who has a much larger work, al-Qawa'id al-Kubra, which is one of the brilliant works in Islamic legal philosophy. But this al-Qawa'id al-Sughra is very, very beneficial and talks about what makes some things of greater reward than others, what makes certain things more sinful than others, and the principles related to that, and to appreciate all the wisdom of legislation. So mu'amalat, firstly, relate to harming others, if not fulfilled. And of course, harming yourself spiritually too, right? And this is pointed to in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not consume one another's wealth in wrongful ways. Right? إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. Unless it be through trade on the basis of clear mutual agreement. That when that clear mutual agreement is not there in transactions, you are wrongfully باطل بالظلم بالحرمة والظلم, right? In a manner that is prohibited and that's zulm, that is wrongful, right? I believe that's from Surah An-Nisa, correct? لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. That's number one. But then, so that's one, is you're harming others, right? But we know religiously, right, that what is one of the most important conditions for the acceptability of our actions in general, our worship in specific, our supplications in particular, it is طيب حل المال وطيبه, right? It's for one's wealth to be permissible and wholesome, right? And you can find the hadith of إن الله طيب لا يقبل إلا طيبا, right? Allah is pure and accepts only the pure. And in our lessons in the 40 Nawawi, we went through the explanation of this hadith, and you can find the related lessons from that hadith. And if you look in right, the commentaries, if you have access to any of them, like Mullah Ali al-Qari or al-Jardani or others, they explain the hadith, because then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the man on a lengthy journey. Ash'ath aghbar, disheveled and dusty, yamuddu yadayhi ila as-sama', who raises both hands up to the heavens, Ya Rab, in desperation. But وَمَطْعَمُهُ حَرَامٌ وَمَشْرَبُهُ حَرَامٌ, in some narrations. وَمَلْبَسُهُ حَرَامٌ, but their food and their drink and their clothing were all from the haram, as a result of haram transactions. Or, haram there is either hurmata butlan or hurmata fasad, whether invalid or corrupt transactions. So he's in state of desperation. And we know generally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that Allah describes himself as أَمَّن يُجِيبُ دُعَاءَ الْمُضْطَرِّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ, the one who answers the call of the distressed when they call. And here, this man on a lengthy journey, dirty, dirty and dusty and desperate, raising his hands in the sky. Another narration mentioned that this person otherwise is a person who prays and fasts and does all these things, but their wealth is from the haram. What does the Prophet say? فَأَنَّا يُسْتَجَابُ لَهُ. And it's a very comprehensive. So how and why and where would their supplication be answered? Why? إِنَّ اللَّهَ طَيِّبٌ لَا يَقْبَلُ إِلَّا طَيِّبًا. Allah is pure and accepts only the pure. Right? And the طيب has two levels, right? The طيب مكان حلالا ما خلا عن الحرام ما خلا عن حرمة وشبهة. The basic طيب, which is the halal, which is that which is free of the haram, and then that is free of the shubuhat, right? So it's a valid transaction. It's not a corrupt transaction. There are not rights of others relating to it. Disliked, prohibited, connected matters don't relate to it, like the buyu' al-makruha, like the disliked sales, prohibitively disliked sales. There's secondary meanings that don't bring in elements of dislikedness in it. These are the levels of shubha, of doubt, that enter into a transaction. So these are very significant at the level of, at the personal level, but in terms of the acceptability of our own worship. But beyond that, these affect human relationships. These affect human relationships, right? Of the strongest of means of the breaking of family ties is financial matters, and the non-definition in financial matters. That's at the level of individuals, right? Society, right? These things result in dhulm, right? They result both in harm, and also when the transactions aren't sound, there becomes a lack of trust. Their oppression comes in. When you have riba and other things, the wealthy oppress the poor through riba and gharar and all these things. So it causes many harms resulting from the non-adherence to the parameters of good given by the Creator, which is why the ulama say, what is the hikmah? What is the wisdom of the legislation, of the rulings related to transactions? Right? Allah, the Imam al-Haskafi explains it is بقاء نظام العالم, the remaining of good order in this world, right? Remaining of good order in this world, meaning in a manner that prevents harm from the individual, in dealings, in society, and in the world at large. Right? The prevention of harm and the preservation of good at the level of the individual, at the level of relations between the two transacting parties, in society itself, and number two, in creation itself. Right? So that's why, there are many merits mentioned with respect to transactions. And we can share the PDF of Sheikh Yusuf al-Nabhani's work, Dalilu Tujar ila Akhlaq al-Akhyar. A guide for those transacting, for traders, literally, those transacting to through the character, conduct, and ethics. Akhlaq covers character, conduct, and ethics of the most virtuous. Right? It has a beautiful collection of prophetic guidance and scholarly teaching on the ethics of trade. And in this, we would recommend anyone who cares about their akhirah as they approach this chapter to refer to and to read Imam al-Ghazali's related chapter, the related book in the Ihya on Kitab Adab al-Kasbi wal-Ma'isha, the book on the adab, the proprieties of earning a living, and of Ma'isha, the rulings related to financial matters, which is from the Ihya, from the second quarter of the Ihya, and this is capably translated by Dr. Adi Satya, A-D-I, S-E-T, Adi, first name, last name Satya, S-E-T-I-A. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect and preserve Dr. Adi. There are many classical works written on this idea of the akhlaq of trade. Of the God-fearing scholars, bi'idhnillah, who have written about this and that are accessible in Shaykh Wahba Zuhaili, he has a book called Al-Mu'amalat al-Maliyya al-Mu'asira, right? Contemporary financial transactions. It's published by Darul Fikr. It's actually translated into English. It's a bit of an expensive translation, 2 volumes, usually overpriced. But if you know Arabic, you can access the Arabic stuff. We should share a link, share the PDF of this, Al-Mu'amalat al-Maliyya al-Mu'asira, by Dr. Wahba Zuhaili. He goes into the aspects of the character of trade. And that's an important aspect, right? Because we want to understand the fiqh properly, but we don't want to divorce fiqh from guidance. So these are things that the onus is on you to put time and effort into some of these things. Reaching level 3 in a text like this, it's also important to read some of the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. We did some sessions previously on the work of Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani, if you recall, those of you we did it during Quduri, correct? And those are with the lessons, right? If you double check, so Zain, if you could just double check that the lessons on the Dalilu Tujar are included in the Quduri lessons, bi'idhnillah. But here, bi'idhnillah, because we have a 2-hour time slot, here we will, bi'idhnillah, be doing about half an hour each lesson, briefly, from Sheikh Nuruddin Itr's work. We'll take selected hadiths on some of the key hadiths related to transactions. Right? From Sheikh Nuruddin Itr's work, which is called I'lam al-Anam Sharh Bulugh al-Maram. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani has a wonderful collection of the hadiths of the blessed hadiths of our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam on legal rulings, and Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, a contemporary hadith scholar and master of the Islamic sciences, who passed away within the last few months. He has a really good commentary on it called I'lamul Anam. But we'll be looking at some of the hadiths and just taking some of the points from it to appreciate some of the bases for the legal rulings a little bit, but also especially looking at some of the ethical dimensions as well, right? Because that's an area that is neglected. Bi'idhnillah. So we'll be doing this class twice a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and the section on transactions does not take that long. It's about 24 or so classes, and we'll be done, bi'idhnillah. And we'll be touching here and there on some of the contemporary issues. This is not a class for fiqh al-mu'amalat, but for fiqh al-mu'amalat al-mu'asira of contemporary issues, but we'll be touching upon some of the underlying frameworks for some of the contemporary issues. To widen your understanding as a talib ilm, it's also important, and we should share this as a resource for you to read on contemporary Islamic finance matters from reliable authorities in the subject. And one of these, without doubt, is Shaykh is Mufti Taqi Usmani, and his work Islamic Finance and Introduction is an important work. It's one of the most important brief works in that subject. And you should just make a goal for yourself that over 12 weeks you should go through all of Islamic Finance and Introduction. That'll give you a lot of valuable insights. When we come to the section on riba, which the books of fiqh take as just a given, we'll unpack a little more on the prohibition of riba, etc. So that's, and now how do you prepare for this class? Inshallah, we'll give you the tools to benefit from the class. In the class resources, inshallah, we'll have access to the text of the Kanz itself, and the Bushra edition of the Kanz is beneficial. Like week by week, we strive to share with you the slides to the class, etc. That's got a translation, etc. So you can follow along. It's very much a draft translation, so it's not for public sharing. We're still working it out. But the Bushra edition of the Kanz is useful. It's available to many booksellers. For those of you who have a more solid background in Arabic and have some more exposure, like the Trontonians in this class, if you're able to follow along from the commentary of Mullah Miskin and its notes by Abu Saud, that's what I'll be using, and I'll be referring to it here and there. And we'll, inshallah, we need to share these resources. We can make them available on the course page, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So what is the outcome of this course? So one should understand and appreciate the nuances, the details and nuances related to the core issues of transactions. Number one. Number two, have the key principles that enable us to understand the contemporary issues related to applying the fiqh al-mu'amalat in our time. So we're not going to go into too many of the derivative scenarios necessarily, but we'll take many of the foundational principles, and so where there are issues that need addressing at the foundational level, so that you are prepared to understand the application of Hanafi fiqh to contemporary issues. and also to appreciate more more of the reasoning around these core issues, so that one has clarity about it oneself and is able to convey that with clarity to others. So that's how we're going to cover it. In the beginning, it's very important to understand clearly the nature of a contract. So that's what we're going to begin with next week. What is the aqdul bay', the sales transaction? What are its key constituent elements? And that gives us a clear framework to approach the subjects. We're going to approach that in a certain amount of detail. We'll be frequently referring to the majalla. The majalla, we should share the translation of it, which is available in a hyperlinkable version online. So just link to that. And number two, the translation. Someone may have to do push-ups because I couldn't find it on at least on the online edition. I don't think it's there. The Sharh al-Atasi is available for those who are more advanced students of knowledge. You could benefit from Sharh al-Atasi, but don't get lost in it. There's no merit in just reading commentaries because they're above our level. But I'll be pointing out some points in it that are of undeniable benefit. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So that's what I want to share about how the importance of this subject, how we're going to approach it. And we know the words of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, that talabul halal faridatun ba'd al-fara'id, that seeking a lawful living is a duty after the ritual duties, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, at-tajiru sadiqul amin, right? The trader who's true and trustworthy, yuhshar, will be resurrected with the prophets and the veracious and the martyrs, right? Will be is of the best of people, right? Because you are tested. And Allah tells us in the Quran, right, that one of the mazahirul ibtila, there are certain things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us with. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. These things that Allah tests us with, right? One of these things that Allah tests us with, and He tells us elsewhere in the Quran about this as well. One of the key things that we are tested with is our wealth, right? And it relates to the reality of the weakness of the human being. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, right? The human temperament is jubilat ala madha? Ala shuh, right? It's temperamentally we have been created with a stinginess, a cheapness, right? And that's why the early Muslims said, never bear witness to anyone being righteous until you have transacted with them in testing circumstances, or you have traveled with them in testing circumstances, or you've been their neighbor over a long period of time. Okay? Because, right? So this is of the significant matters, right? So that's what we want to cover today. Before we close, any questions, bi'idhnillah?
Yeah, I had a question.
Bismillah.
Would you recommend dipping into, from time to time, a nahu al-fa'iq, or is that too above the scope?
Abu Saud deals with most of the essence of an-nahr al-fa'iq, right? That Abu Saud really gives you the lub of the essence of the bahr and the nahar, not the whole discussions and stuff, but the key explanation. So, I mean, it doesn't hurt if someone's comfortable, but with it, but just he goes into a lot of details, and very often the more details you go into, the more the khilaf there is. The closer you are to the trunk of the madhab, the less khilaf there is. Yeah, Abu Hanifa is right. It's called the Hanafi madhab, right? But the more you go into the derived details, the more likelihood there is for subtleties and difference of opinion, right? And we don't. That's not the focus of the class, right? Those detailed derived discussions. It's very easy to get lost in there, but yeah, but once in a while to dip into it to check something, etc. But you find most of what's most practically useful there can be found in the in what's this edition called? The the تعليقات الماتعة, right? Muhammad Ahsan al-Nanutwi, and completed by Maulana Habib al-Rahman, called التعليقات الماتعة على كنز الدقائق, which is a Bushra edition of Kanz al-Daqa. That's good. Better than that is Mulla Miskeen with Abu Saud, but together, but either one that you feel comfortable with, but we'll try to unpack the class. But for assistance, both of these are of benefit. Any other questions?
I have a bit of a more general question, but related to the class. So given how widespread mu'amalat is, everyone goes through it, and knowing the rulings are obligatory so as not to fall into the haram, are there accessible books to teach the common person who isn't on the road to becoming a scholar? Like, how can we teach our family, for example?
First, learn. That's the first concern, right? So a number of the Arab scholars have written on this, on these subjects for the common, for the general audience. You have short treatises, from the Syrian scholars by the likes of Shaykh al-Burhani and others. They're short treatises on financial transactions and so on, and daily transactions, etc. There's a lot of these small small treatises. There's also in more recent times, people like Sheikh Wahb al-Zuhaili and others, their Mu'amalat al-Maliyya al-Mu'asira, etc. It's meant to be a guide for the educated person, right? But they're still somewhat on the longer side. That's why we have the course on money matters, for example, that covers a sliver of what people need to know about financial transactions. Sometimes students of knowledge need to know a little bit about reality too. It's a course we'll be reteaching, but that's a general course that is of benefit. But there's many works in Urdu, for example, or in Turkish, etc., that do similarly. Yeah, but there's a lack of material, and that's from the harms of sort of academic Islam. People are worried about the transition of legal, legal and hadith methodology between Balkh and Farghana or wherever, like some in the 3rd and 4th century Hijri. But what about the legal reality of the people in front of you, right? Because the most important of matters is the fard al-ayn and then the fard al-kifaya. That's what ilm is about. That the most important of matters that you have a fard ayn before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you have a fard kifaya that is to be fulfilled, right? And of the harms of academics is that it's based on curiosity and investigation, but to what end? Oh, that's interesting, right? You ask a alim, is what you're doing interesting? They think you're a fool, right? What I think about it, what I feel about it is irrelevant, right? Right? They say al-mu'min يعني مقيم في الحقوق لا في الحظوظ. The true believer is one who is firmly established in rights, not interests. Any other questions, inshallah?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
It might be a bit weird, but so on the course page is the statement from Imam Muhammad rahimahullah about writing about zuhud, and then he says something about knowing the rules of transactions allows us to have more taqwa. So it's a bit weird, but how do I act upon what I learn in this class or use it so then I can have more taqwa or become more of a zahid?
No, that's a really good question. Jazakallah ta'ala khairan. Because the taqwa, right? What is the operational definition of taqwa? Taqwa has levels and all kinds of stuff, right? But as Imam al-Ghazali says in beginning of assistance and beginning of guidance, right? That hidayah, guidance, has a beginning and has an end. The end meaning the aim and purpose and fulfillment, right? Which is to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But he says ends are not reached if beginnings are not fulfilled, right? And the beginning of guidance is acting upon knowledge. Likewise, taqwa has an end. The highest of taqwa is that you shield yourself from everything that in any way diminishes your presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's the highest of taqwa. Taqwa al-aghyar بصدق التوجه للواحد القهار. Right? It's to shield oneself from all otherness by being truly turned to the one, the overwhelming. But that's the end. That's what one should seek. But what's the beginning of taqwa? The operational beginning of taqwa is, that's what the fuqaha define, taqwa is tarkul haram, is to leave the haram. Right? Right? Zuhud, again, has great levels, but zuhud, the first level of zuhud is to operationalize taqwa. Then you leave the doubtful. Then you leave what distracts you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you leave your attachments that in any way disadvantage you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So zuhud has steps as well. All of them are grounded in the fiqh of transactions. As you learn, apply that knowledge to your day-to-day transactions. That when you make agreements, you should be able to distinguish between what's a contract, what's a promise, what is a commitment, and you know what would make a sound contract, so that if you trade, if you deal with people, you make it clear. Sometimes it's a bid'ah to speak ill of the Muslims, but people say, I don't like dealing with Muslims. Why? Because they don't fulfill. Said, did you write down the contract? No. Did you define the terms? No. Is it even clear what the transaction is? No. Students of knowledge do it all the time, right? So that's not, so it's a very noble intention. May Allah bless you and all of us in that as you go through, Waqi', who was one of the great imams of hadith and of the teachers of Imam al-Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad took from him as well, and he was of those who took extensively from Imam Abu Hanifa, and he was known for his brilliant memory. It's related from him that كنا نستعين على حفظ أحاديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بالعمل بها. We used to seek assistance in memorizing the hadith of the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم by acting upon it, right? So each lesson, like one should aim to have a theoretical understanding of it, a practical understanding of it, but also a practice understanding of it. Then am I implementing this? Or at least striving to implement it, because there's things that are higher standards. Am I striving to implement this, right? And it's natural that in doing so, you would have questions, okay? When you buy online, etc. And that's where it'd be very beneficial if you approach it with that mindset. But those questions are best at the end of the class to ask those questions. How does this relate to this, and this? And it's good to, the more you ask, inshallah, the more all of us will benefit through this journey, through the fiqh of transactions. I hope that answers your question, inshallah. Okay. One thing, inshallah, because a number of you are here, that let's practice the raise the hands thing to ask questions, because alhamdulillah, if we have a good number of people participating, sometimes, we say, anyone has a question, multiple people can come in that way. And also, sometimes some people can be faster than others in asking, etc. So we can, in that way, give everyone a fair opportunity as well. So any other questions before we close, bismillah? Okay. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وصلي وسلم وبارك على النعمة المهداة والرحمة المزداة سيدنا ونبينا محمد المجتبى وعلى آله وصحبه ذوي الوفا وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا واقبلنا واجعلنا من عبادك المخلصين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلي وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Inshallah, we'll see you in our next class on Thursday.